At this time, I'd like to introduce Tom Whittrock, and he'll be talking about guitars and blues and numerous things. So come on up.
My name is Tom Whittrock, and I don't have an Oscar. He passed away in the fish tank, so those of you, that's enough of the Tommy Whitlock jokes. So, my biography was included in this morning's email, but I feel the need to repeat some of it just because that's what this is. I was born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1952 and quickly escorted out of the state to the state of Texas. I don't know if there was a legal reason or whatever, but my folks went to San Antonio, Dallas, and eventually landed in Houston around 1955, where I grew up into my 20s before I moved to Springfield. My guitar interest started pretty much after my senior year of high school. 1970, I graduated Lamar High School, Houston, Texas. My brother returned from his stint in the Navy with his 50s Les Paul, Gibson Les Paul, that was converted to look like a 59 and play like one, and started encouraging me to be more and more interested in guitars, which I was, and I was going away to college the fall of 1970 and getting interested in guitar both from my roommate and other people in the dormitory, and my brother, who has helped and encouraged me more than I've ever admitted, although I should. He sent me to school every week with a different guitar. So I'd go home to Houston, I'd go back with a different guitar to play for a week, and I got to try many different great guitars this way. And it also kind of built a love and a passion both for guitars themselves and in particular vintage guitars, which owing to my age and my time period, I feel roughly a vintage guitar is pre-1970. Actually, there's no true definitions at all in somebody's perception, so there is no cutoff date. My brother opened a used and vintage guitar store in Houston, Texas called Rock and Robin in 1972 while I was still living in Houston. And this store still exists 44 years later. It was a big inspiration for me as far as being in the guitar business, and he discouraged me from trying to join or work in his store. He encouraged me to spend my time playing guitar. He said that's a much better pursuit of guitar interests. And of course, this is my older brother. I didn't listen. I wanted to do what he did. So, in the summer of 73 and the summer of 74, my brother and I both came up to Springfield with a bass player to visit his old Navy buddy, Bob Bledsoe. Bob, who grew up in Springfield at the time, was living out north of Strafford, still in Greene County. Actually at Murphy Hill, the highest point in Greene County, for those of you who might be cartographers. And while jamming out there and coming into town and doing a few extremely obscure gigs, I met both Bud Johnson and Bo Brown. And the one gig location I remember that we played, which no longer exists, was the Fourth Dimension, which was over on Seminole, about a block east of Glenstone. We also went to the Phase 3, which is now known as the Stepchild, and we went out to the club, I think it was called the Continental Club on West Sunshine, which became the Sugar Shack when Keith McCormick was there and is now a strip club. I haven't been in since it was the Sugar Shack. So, in 1975, I grew sick and tired of the gigantic city of Houston, Texas, and that rat race, and decided I had to get out. And my buddy Bob Bledsoe invited me to come live in the Ozarks until I decided where I wanted to end up. So I moved to a little house outside Northview for a few weeks when we both decided to move into Springfield, get a house. And I've been in Springfield ever since 1975. In our house, we built a jam room where we covered the walls with egg cartons and quilts and blankets so that we could make a loud noise and hopefully our neighbors wouldn't be too upset. We also had the good foresight to ask our neighbors if they were going to be bothered and let them know what we were doing, just so they'd come talk to us before they called the police for us causing all this. One of the more outstanding events of jamming at that house in 1975 was meeting one of my best friends of all time, Mr. Bill Brown. And many of you remember Bill or Billy Brown, and I have to say at this point, Bill was so young, his mother had to drive him over to our house. Bill's mother, Joan, is here right now. It's wonderful to see you again, Joan, Bill Brown's mother. And it was very nice of you to bring her over to a house with a bunch of older guys, 20-somethings, playing music, and leave him there unchaperoned, so to speak. And I promise we didn't do too much to him. So we had a great time, and it was really exciting. Also during 1975, as I was already starting to gain the interest of collecting guitars and had bought a few and was trying to resell a few, my good friend Bud Johnson came over to the house one day and he said, you know, over at the rock shop, they just got in one of those guitars that you just talk about all the time, as if he was tired of hearing me talk about these guitars. And so we call these guitars bursts, but they were Gibson Les Paul standards from the late 1950s in sunburst finish. So I ran over to the rock shop, and there it was, a beautiful 1960 burst. This one right here, which I still have today. And it was an exceptionally good condition, great guitar. The price tag was $2,000, which to me seemed to be a bargain. And with the help of my father, who loaned me the money, and I did repay him, with the help of my father, I got the money together, bought the guitar, and quickly found out I was the talk of the town, the crazy idiot who spent $2,000 for a used guitar, the likes of which you could buy the exact same thing brand new for $500, less if you knew somebody like Johnny Gott or Mark Morton. But I knew that these things were being priced higher than $2,000 at that moment, and I thought, that's a bargain. And to be honest with you, this thing has paid me more than enough dividends to be worth more to me than whatever money it represents. So, in early 1976, I got the idea to open a store. I talked to a couple of friends, one of which was Dave Wilson. And we were entertaining the idea of going into business together, but it wasn't simple as it sounds. I went to the city to get a business license and found out you have to have a business name before you can get a license. So then came the naming process. And if any of you have ever been in a band that spent an entire band rehearsal trying to name the band, you'll understand some of the fun we had trying to name the store. And luckily, a disinterested person threw out this very weird name, which I just immediately settled on, Third Eye Music. And despite the fact that it may mean a lot of things to different people, it wasn't any specific meaning for me. And, 40 years later, it seems a bit odd, but it worked. People who couldn't remember the name would know, it's the one with a really strange name. And back then, we all used the yellow pages to find things. And yeah, it wasn't hard. Springfield Music, Hoover Music, Lines Music. Oh, Third Eye Music. Yeah, that's the one, because it's the weird name. So that worked. And my first store was over on Lombard Street at the corner of Glenstone, right behind Waddell's Market, and right across from the bridal shop. And in a little house that was luckily zoned commercial, had to double check that, and opened the store for 6 months. During that 6 months, I met my first true partner in the business who bought into it with me, a gentleman named Frank Carnahan. Frank also grew up in Springfield, and his passion for guitars was more quiet, but it was still there. He had a deep passion for guitars, and quickly he became the repairman and refinisher in the store, which the store really needed. When you buy and sell used guitars, there's likelihood you'll have a lot of repair issues, and in some cases, you can make a good living off of repairing. When Frank joined the business with me in September of '76, we moved downtown to the old Votah Music Building on Walnut Street, which was 211 East Walnut. I'm not even sure what's in that slot right now, but it's right next to the covered parking lot. And I still drive by there from time to time and see it. And, oh boy, there was my old home. Also, in late 1977, I helped form a band with my friend, again, Bob Bledsoe, and a bass player named J.L. Roberts, and two gentlemen from Branson, Greg Turpin and Mo Paul. And we called it Bluesberry Jam. Now, Chris Albert asked me to bring this poster as much for the fact that we're playing at Bebop's, way, way out North Glenstone, out to the Crystal Caverns turnoff. These are two posters. There were three, but two fit. These were drawn by Mo Paul, who was also an interesting artist and quite a character, harmonica player, singer, but character describes him as much as anything. Wonderful guy. Anybody wants to look at some of his nice artwork, it does kind of bring back some 60s thoughts there. We quickly found out that group of musicians was not going to work very well because of the separation of Branson and Springfield, not wanting to go there, etc. So Bob, J.L. Roberts, and I decided to reform the band in Springfield, and in lieu of another lead player, we added Hugh Walpole. And Hugh Walpole was hired or encouraged to join mainly for his piano playing at the time, but he saw a nice double neck lap steel in my store and said, "Can I string that up and put it on top of my piano and play some steel guitar licks too?" I said, "Well, of course. I don't see anything wrong with that. More variety." So we actually had steel guitar, piano, bass, guitar, and drums. And our very first performance, which is what I call the birth of the Bluesberries, was March 17th, 1978, St. Patrick's Day, at the Legion Hall. And it was also known as Sunday, and this is a poster from our very first gig as the Bluesberries. Unfortunately, the band didn't continue very much at that time, and has been a band that has started and stopped again numerous times over the decades. But the next version that came up was 1981. And one of the biggest changes in my musical life in Springfield was getting to know and play with Mr. Dave Painter. He's here today. Thank you. Dave was a college student at SMS, and he was quite a lot of fun to be around, and encouraging as a guitar player and encouraging as a songwriter, along with some other people we were playing with. And we reformed a version of the Bluesberries with Bob Bledsoe, Dave, Hugh Walpole, myself, and now with bass player Dan Boytz. At some point about 20 years ago, Dave Painter made this poster right here, and it shows photos of probably 15 different Bluesberries members. That would be maybe half of them, depending on who you count. But as far as people who actually played gigs with us, not just came up and sat in for a song. And there's been many others since then. Also in 1978 was a big change in the vintage guitar business. There started the Dallas Guitar Show. And although there had been vintage guitar shows before in very small ways, the Dallas Guitar Show morphed into the granddaddy of vintage guitar shows and still exists today. I was at the first show with my brother and several other people, and it was actually the point where I bought my second burst, which was also a 1960 burst, very similar to this one. And that was the only one dealt at that show, and I started getting more of a nationwide reputation, albeit very tiny at that moment, but I started getting more of a reputation for this type of guitar, which I quickly gravitated to. It's my favorite type of guitar to play. So many of my big guitar heroes played this type of guitar, from guys like Eric Clapton, Billy Gibbons, Dwayne Allman, Joe Walsh, Peter Green, Paul Kossoff, Jeff Beck, etc., Jimmy Page, and dozens of others either made their name with that type of guitar or made a big part of their name with that type of guitar. I love their music. I wanted that kind of guitar. And that's At the Dallas Guitar Show, things started blooming. This will be an annual event, and now has still gone on even this year and continues. That was a big part of business for me and still is. I do a lot of business at these guitar shows, and it really helps the store stay alive. In September of 1978, the store outgrew the need for the old Votaw music store downtown. My partner Frank bought a house on Elm Street, and the store moved into the house. 742 East Elm, not too far from Sun Villa. Frank and I lived in the second floor. The store was built into the first floor, and with a refinish paint booth built into the basement, which the fire department gladly approved after they saw how diligent Frank was about building a paint booth. So that location would be approximately where the high-rise parking lot is behind JQH Arena, or not JQH, Juanita K. Hammond's Hall for the Performing Arts. Facing onto Elm, I can walk up the corner stairs to the upper levels and look out and see the same view I saw at my window from the store. In those days, that was a lot of fun, living in the college neighborhood, being around lots of musicians of all ages, being close to several venues like Humphrey Clinkers and Mustaches and all the downtown bars and places we would play. We played one night at Mustaches, which is over where Bear's Burgers are near the old Harlow's. And the owner called us up about 5 minutes before and said, "Are you guys going to be here?" And I said, "Of course. We still got 5 minutes." And I think we could have walked it, but we got there on time. Throughout the 1980s, the Bluesberries featured me and either Dave Painter or Bill Brown as the second guitar player, and on some occasions, both of us, or both of them, meaning all three of us. And we eventually got in the habit of calling it the Guitar Army, with 3 lead guitar players, which was an assault on your ears, but hopefully some people here have still survived it. I do remember playing at Cartoons one time where we were wailing away, and I was playing rhythm at the moment while Dave and Bill were both playing solos, and Gary Summers came up to me and said, "It's too loud." So I reached right behind me and turned my amp off, and I said, "Is it still too loud?" "Yes." "Don't talk to me." The typical kind of things you do as a musician when it's too loud. And I did have one example, only one example, where I was playing with the Bluesberries, and we filled in for the Lefty Brothers at the Townhouse. They had a gig with the Beach Boys down in Branson or Sunville or Lampe. So we went out to the Townhouse for our one night, and after the first set, one of the bouncers, those guys who could block the sun, those giant guys, came up to me and said, "Manager wants to talk to you." Okay, are we fired already? And it was a nice elderly lady. And she said, "Are you guys holding back? Can you crank it up a little bit?" Never heard that before or since, but it was, I'll never forget it. It's almost as good as the compliment we were paid the time we opened for Buddy Guy down at the Regency. We did a number of great shows at the Regency, including opening for Johnny Winter a couple times, Bugs Henderson. But Buddy Guy, after we opened for him, he came up on the microphone, and whether it was true or not, it didn't matter. He said something to the effect to the audience, "You've got some great live music here. Me and the guys in the band we're standing in the back listening to this band," meaning us, "and stealing their licks." Well, I didn't believe it, but I was so happy he said that. That was a very, very generous thing for somebody like Buddy Guy to say to us. And those sort of things always stick with you. In the 1980s, I started buying and selling these types of guitars, the Sunburst Les Pauls, which I refer to as bursts. In a very heavy and numerous ways, I went through as many as 65 of these throughout the heyday of my selling these guitars. And they are considered the finest example of Gibson Les Paul ever made. And to this extent, there are about 1,500 of them were made, of which maybe Depending on who you ask, maybe 2,000 are accounted for, owing to fakes. More realistically, about half of them have probably been accounted for, maybe a little bit more. But it has become my passion and my history to collect and deal these guitars. And at certain points, I had way more than anybody should ever have, and that's not the case anymore. There was a point where I made a poster of my collection. When I had 17 of these guitars, I made a poster with 16. I'll show you. So this poster has been around the world, and I brought some extras here for anybody who wants a copy of the poster. This is even shown in the office buildings of Gibson behind the current owner of Gibson, Henry Juskowitz. I've seen them in different countries around the world. Even Gibson uses these near the paint booth in one of their parts of their factory for color reference. It really put me on the map for these things. By the early 1990s, the prices of these guitars had jumped from under $10,000 to well over $20,000 and $30,000 a piece. And around 1992, I bought one that cost me $45,000. And I said, enough is enough. Even though it's business and I can make some profit on this somewhere down the line, I'm too hesitant to spend that kind of money just to continue my collecting and or business dealings of these guitars. And I had a lot of them. I thought, okay, I'm going to pretty well cool my jets on buying these guitars, sell some of what I have, keep as many as I can stand to keep, and that's what I've done ever since. But that certainly bankrolled the store in many ways over the last 25 years, or 20 years at least. I went to the Dallas Guitar Show since it started in 1978. The promoters who started it broke off into a second group, two groups, and the second group became what's known now as the Arlington, Texas Guitar Show. They're held roughly 6 months apart, so they don't compete. And these two guitar shows are by far the largest guitar shows ever in the world. There's nothing anywhere, no Los Angeles, New York, any other place in the country that has anything like what happens in Dallas and Arlington. And if anybody's a guitar fanatic or guitaraholic, as I like to call myself, I heavily encourage you to consider going to either one of those. The Dallas show features a lot more music performance. It's become a guitar festival. The Arlington show is still a guitar show and has more guitars. So the Bluesberries continued throughout all these years, on and off again. Into the early 1990s, it started to change to a more permanent group, but once again, there's always little factors that come in, and we always end up in different bands. How many bands are you in, Dave, right now? Yeah, 5, 8. Yeah, you can get back with me on that. So nothing was completely permanent for the Bluesberries until I would say roughly the early 2000s, around 2003 or 4, when I started playing with Dave Painter, B.J. Rossi, and Bert Parnell. Now, I'd spent a lot of times with a lot of other really great musicians, several of which are here. Dave Kamey played drums with us for more years than probably anybody else, unless B.J. has surpassed that number now. I'm not counting. And I've had the pleasure of playing full gigs with a number of you guys and having a number of you set in for a song or two, and it's always, there's a lot of great people involved here. Springfield's music scene is very interesting, very vibrant, and I am so glad to have been a part of this. Around 1998, at one of the large Arlington guitar shows, I met a friend who became one of my closest friends of all time, a German gentleman named Bernd Grohl, who prefers to go by Bernard because it's easier for English-speaking people to say. And Bernd and I quickly realized that we shared the passion for the guitars far more than we shared the passion for the money they represent. And I have to say, there have been many times when I've been disappointed when I go to shows and I have guitars like this, and the only questions I get are, what is it worth? And I don't mind somebody asking me that today if you want to, but I can tell you that it's worth, like a lot of things, far more than the dollars it represents. As any of you have pets know, we won't go to children, we'll just go to pets. What's the value of your long-beloved pet? You don't put it in money. Well, in some ways, we have possessions we feel stronger about than what they may or may not sell for. And while this thing would sell in the neighborhood of, say, $300,000, it's something that means a lot more to me than the money it represents. And as long as I have that passion, I'll continue to be the guitar lover I am, as I've been a guitar player, guitar collector, and guitar dealer. My friend Bernhard Grohl in Germany started encouraging me to come over there to visit him. He lived in Cologne, a city of 1 million, one of the larger cities in Germany. And finally, in 2004, I jumped on an airplane, went over there and visited him and his girlfriend. They had a band called Rita and the Rock and Rollers. They ended up playing at Harlow's. A few of you may have seen them at the 2 times they were at Harlow's. I went over and visited them, and we went to a couple of venues to watch bands. We didn't have anything set up to play except one jam session. And over there, I found that the majority of things they call jam sessions are usually a group of 3 or 4 bands that each get a set. And it's not the typical grab people out of the audience and create a jam out of whoever happens to show up. After we played our one set at this one jam, one of the gentlemen in the next band, the singer, asked me if I would get up and play with them. And I go, oh, I do get to jam. Great. He said, can you do Jumpin' Jack Flash? I said, sure. What key? Key of H. Now, I know some of you musicians know what key H is, but I sure didn't. And I figured, okay, just mess with the American. So I go back over to the guitar amp, get ready to set it up. And the bass player's right next to me, and he says, well, you ought to just stay for the whole set. And I said, really? And he shows me the set list, and Jumpin' Jack Flash was the last song. And I look at all of them, they got the keys next to them, and sure enough, Jumpin' Jack Flash was in the key of H. Well, there's only so many possibilities. I could figure it out, but I asked him anyway. Oh, you call it B. So if any of you wanted to play in the key of H, it's B, or B natural. I'm not enough of a music scholar to understand that. The next jam session I went to in my next trip in 2005 was the next eye-opening experience dealing with Germans at jam sessions. As I called off, let's do a shuffle in A. And sure enough, they all played in E. That's because the letter E is pronounced A in German, as it is in a lot of Romance languages. A, E, O, U. So I had to stop them and say, no, American A. But you learn some great things when you're in another country, and by golly, I've had wonderful times over there. Now I go over there 2 times a year, in May and in November. My friend Bernhard Grohl has created a band for us, and it's called Tom Whittrock and Friends. And we play little pubs and dives and parks and clubhouses. And we pass the hat, and we get hopefully free beer, and we have so much fun. It's as much fun as playing there with these guys, almost as much fun as the Bluesberries. The music's not quite as good, but it keeps getting a little better every time. And the friendliness of these people, Germany's a wonderful place. I encourage anybody to go visit it who has the time. Again, I have an incredible passion for guitars. I love guitars. And in my store, buying and selling used guitars, my inventory is what I find or what finds me. There's not a place you call up to order more guitars when you need more for the store. You have to encourage people or go hunt them. And I find a lot of times the excitement of seeing somebody walk up to the door with a guitar case. What's in there? It's a big question mark until it walks in, and it could be anything. And I've also found that a number of times I've been extremely excited about things that had very little dollar value, but they were unbelievably interesting for a wide variety of reasons. Maybe it was made like nothing else. Maybe it was something I'd never seen before and not even heard of. But so many different things have come my way through the shop. It's really kind of fun. It's like being in the antique business, I guess. In more recent years, around 2011, I entered into a contract with the Gibson Guitar Company to copy one of my guitars. And the guitar they chose, it was called, this series is called Collector's Choice. And foolish me, I thought Collector's Choice meant that the collector got to choose, but it didn't turn out to be that way. They already had a guitar of mine in mind, and it was a 1959 Sunburst that I named Sandy. Now, I haven't named every single guitar, but I've named a lot of them, and it's not that unusual, although some people think it's kind of crazy, but it's not that unusual. So Gibson copied Sandy because it was pre-sold out. I found out after. In fact, out of the contract was for minimum 25, maximum 300. They made 350. That Gibson, you know, they don't always do things exactly according to the rules. And when I found out about these extra guitars, I got the answer I expected. What, nobody talked to you? And the next thing, which I half expected, was, well, don't worry, you'll get paid for them. Yeah. Well, that wasn't the point, you know, it's limited. Let's keep it limited. So, but I had a really wonderful time being part of a Gibson project. They have since copied another one of my 1959 Les Pauls. I have encouraged them to copy this 1960 Les Paul, which is colored and featured a little bit different than the 59s. And I've encouraged them to copy some other guitars that belong to other people that they don't know, and a few of my others, just in hopes of getting more riches out of the Gibson people, because they're pretty tight, and I like it when I get a check from Gibson. It's a lot better than sending them one, you know. And the final thing, well, not the final thing, but I do have to say that my life has been drastically better for the last 9 years because I met the wonderful Kelly Browning, who I married in 2009 on June 7th. Will be 7 years tomorrow. Thank you, Kelly. It's amazing that I could find a woman who would put up with me this long, and I'm really hopeful that she can put up with me for a little bit longer, or a lot longer. And I do have a final few things I want to say. The store turned 40 on March 1st. I felt that was a milestone that when I got close enough, I couldn't pass that up. I have no idea how far I'll go in this store. The Bluesberries are 38 years, and I kind of figured they've got to make it to at least 40, even if it didn't play every single year. And the current lineup of the Bluesberries, which I'm very proud of, includes Dave Painter, B.J. Rossi on drums, Rick Salvador, another Springfieldian, on bass guitar, and the great Mr. Bill Jones on saxophone. Hi, Bill. Bill's back there in the back. With a lot of help and leadership from Dave Painter, this band continues to exist and be a fun band. And I did want to say, since I'm a guitar player, I'm not going to name all the people I've played with in town or all the influences in particular. But the guitar influences I've had in this town, not necessarily in any particular order, I'd like to name Bud Johnson, Bill Brown, Dave Painter, Hugh Walpole, and Jimmy Guy Cottengim as my biggest guitar and music influences since I've been here in Springfield. And I'm proud to be still somewhat of a newcomer. I didn't grow up here, but I'm very proud that I landed here and very happy to be a part of this. So that's my presentation for today. I have brought some DVDs, some CDs of the Bluesberries. The DVD is about guitar collecting. These are free if you want them. If you feel the interest in donating, the donations will go to Music Monday, which is a great cause, as this happens the first Monday of every month, and it's a really great event. And I will ask, does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? Yes, Bob.
When you go out to Germany,
yes,
or wherever, you don't take Curly or Sandy?
When I go to Germany, I don't travel with a guitar. It's actually, to get on the small planes in Springfield, you almost have to put them in luggage, which I don't. And my friends in Germany actually loan me guitars. They have all the gear I could need. And one of them has a copy, one of the Gibson Collector's Choice copy of Sandy, which he more or less permanently loans me. So I'm playing a copy of one of my own guitars, and it suits me perfectly. So no, I don't travel with these when I go play outside. And the Bluesberries gigs have always been very close to Springfield, with just a few in the general vicinity. And I do take any or all of my any guitars I feel like, including to the clubs we play here in town, like Carrie's or Cartoons or Classic Rock Coffee. Coming up this Thursday night, the Bluesberries will be at Classic Rock Coffee, 7:30 to 9:30, the Blues and Brews show. And from time to time, I will bring one of my bursts. I have a really heavily worn and beat up 1956 gold top Les Paul that is oxidized so much it's green. It's an ugly army green. And that's my main playing guitar, and it goes to virtually every gig. And so, yes, John?
The rumor is over the years that your guitars are in the Springfield Underground. I mean, that's what we've always heard. Can you confirm or deny that?
Yes, I can confirm or deny that.
No, that's just been the rumor over the years.
Yeah.
It's about your collection, and it's like he's got, $4 billion worth of guitars in the Springfield Underground.
Well, no, that's not true. Nothing is in Springfield Underground, but I'm not going to open any other questions about the location of any of my guitars, which do not happen to be all in one spot. Other question? Yes, sir.
Other than its age,
Yes.
what you find so special about the guitar? Maybe it's the pickups, it's the pots, it's the action. What is it that makes it so worthwhile?
Well, the basic history of the Gibson Les Paul guitar starts in 1952, when Gibson finally decides to follow Les Paul's advice and make a solid body electric guitar because of competition from Fender. They said, we need to do this. So they made a guitar called the Gibson Les Paul in 1952. Over the course of the 50s decade, they made small but important changes in the design of the guitar, to the point where each change constituted an improvement by virtually all our standards and virtually all guitar player standards. And the culmination, the quintessential, the finest version of the Gibson Les Paul was the Sunburst Les Paul Standard, which introduced in mid-1958, made throughout 1959 and 1960. They added the humbucking pickups, which before they were using P90s. They added a tune-o-matic bridge in the mid-50s, which added for more tunability on the bridge. And in 1958, they changed the finish color from gold, which would cover the face of the guitar in an opaque gold metallic color, to a see-through cherry sunburst finish with a two-piece top. The top is curly maple, sometimes heavily figured, sometimes lightly figured, which gives every one of these guitars its distinct face. They are considered the finest Gibson Les Pauls ever made. That's considered the finest solid body electric Gibson ever made, and certainly one of 2 or 3 of the best solid body electric guitars ever made, period. The others probably being the Stratocaster and the Telecaster from Fender. So this being the quintessential version, and right after 1960, Gibson quit making this design of guitar. They did not re-enter into building this body shape and style until 1968, and they went through numerous variations before they came up with something that was really this style of guitar again. It wasn't until about 1974 or 5 when it came back into the marketplace, built very much like this, but not exactly. Yes, sir.
Within those 3 years, 58, 59, 60, are
Yes.
there any change or differences between models within that?
Well, first off, Gibson never did things as year models, so like we think of automobiles. So there's not a 58 version, 59 specifically. They changed features when they felt like it. In general, they changed the fret size in early 1959 to a larger, thicker fret from a thinner style fret that they used to use. That is more popular with the vast majority of people. Throughout that time period and throughout the 50s, the necks were hand-shaped. There is a bit of a misconception as to all 58 necks are great big. All 59 necks are a certain perfect size, and all 1960 necks are a different size. And it never was that categorical. In fact, you could find thin necks and thick necks in every year. In 1959, by the time they added the large frets, most people felt this is the best version of the Les Paul ever made. And there's always this little concept of a 59 is better than a 60 because it's from a decade earlier. But in the middle of 1960, Gibson realized that the red coloring in their finish was ultraviolet sensitive. Actually, they realized this before then, but they didn't do anything about it until mid-1960. Store owners put the guitars in the windows, the sunlight made the guitars fade, and if you look at the poster, all of these guitars started as cherry sunbursts, much like the ones on the bottom row. The top rows are completely faded, and in mid-1960, they went to this new finish with a new red that did not change color. Another thing they did in 1960, which they did pretty much across the Gibson line, not just with Les Pauls, they changed the thickness of the neck. In the depth of the thickness from the fingerboard to the back of the neck became much, much thinner. The width across the nut is still the same width. A lot of people call them thin necks and even pencil neck geeks or whatever, but it's not narrow at the nut, it's narrow in depth, and that happened with all Gibsons throughout late 60, all of 61. So these became the finest of all Gibson Les Pauls ever made, and believe me, Gibson's biggest product today is Gibson Les Pauls, and they make a lot of guitars that are copies or reissues. Yes, Chris?
Well, I once read where Dwayne Allman liked it because of the sustain. That was always the key to rock guys, was they liked the ability that you could really sustain notes with it. That's the wood.
The sustain is a combination of all the factors, including the bridge and the tailpiece and a number of other things. And in fact, there's a number of Les Paul fanatics who feel that an earlier bridge design than this actually has more sustain, the one where the strings just wrap around the bridge and go straight to the nut, and there's no two-pneumatic bridge in front of it. The way the Les Paul Juniors continued to be that way, made that way up into the 60s. But the sustain of any solid body is also partly combined with things like the output of the pickups. The humbuckers are stronger than, say, the single coils in a Fender as far as just their own natural power. The way amplifiers are used, what size amplifier, how loud you're using the amplifier. So sustain is not as simple as just the guitar, but it certainly gave much greater usable sustain than some others. But as anybody who's ever been to a Ted Nugent concert knows that he uses a completely hollow body guitar, or did for many years, to create endless sustain, which was feedback that he controlled. So it did have better sustain than a number of other guitars, but it was a combination of factors, certainly not just the wood.
Did Les Paul have anything to design?
That's a very interesting question, and since he's gone and so is Ted McCarty, who was the head of Gibson at the time, we can read their words and see who claims to have the most input to it. Les had a lot of basic input into the idea, but I think the people at Gibson in the factory workers, the R&D department, whatever it was called at that time, came up with a number of the ideas, like the actual body shape. Carving the top into an arched top was something they did partly to make it harder to copy, to show that they could do something much finer than just take a plank of wood, which Fender did with the Telecaster, and cut a shape out, throw some parts on it. No, this was a fine piece of musical instrument that would be difficult to copy. So, but Les Paul, he supposedly would get a prototype and say, I like it, I don't like it. Anybody who's studied Les Pauls knows that of all the Gibson Les Pauls he ever got, virtually every single one of them he highly modified. He had his own ideas, and they were not what the public wanted necessarily, but he was a tinkerer and one of the very few people who's in the Musicians Hall of Fame and the Inventors Hall of Fame. So he had a lot to do with it, but Gibson had a lot more to do with it. And it's never been nailed down to one person or just one designer. Anybody else? Yes, Mr. Luke.
Tom, one thing I just wanted to make clear, I'm sure you know this, but in April of 2015, the federal government passed a law where, and it certainly helped me in my travel to perform, is airlines must now allow you to take the guitar into the airplane and must store it, either in the overhead or in the case of me taking an old white Falcon about 2 months ago, they actually had to put it in the captain's locker. I had to stand there because they first said, no, put it down. I said, no, the law said. And they did compliment me by putting it in the captain's locker.
A lot of the times when I fly from Springfield, the planes are so tiny, they say there isn't a locker. Now, I've been on the big airplanes going overseas, and there is a locker in first class, or a coat locker, and they're happy to put it there. And they have their fears of putting them in the overhead when it's a heavy, solid body. In fact, I know guys who'll put a guitar like this in a gig bag, and it fools the airline people into thinking, oh, that's just an acoustic and it'll fit better. But there's a certain amount of danger to this also, and I don't want the hassle, and luckily I don't have to. Again, as you say, they passed a law that says they have to let you get the guitar into the cabin of the airplane. When you're standing there and they're telling you no, you can't always force the law, and you don't want to miss your plane. And yet you don't want to just hand your guitar off to be thrown into luggage at late. So I agree, it's always supposed to be allowed. And it's not always quite that simple, but I encourage anybody who is going to travel on an airplane with a guitar to look into it. Number two, try to contact the flight crew. And on our small planes, we'll generally have a pilot, co-pilot, and a flight attendant, and talk to them and tell them what your situation is and ask them to help you as much as they can. But I was flying home from Atlanta with a guitar, and I talked to the captain, and he said there was no place except the overhead to put in that airplane. Now, that's one of those 3-seaters, 1 seat, aisle, and 2 seats. It did fit in the overhead, and I got it in the overhead. So, yes?
When storing your solid bodies, is there anything you do about humidity?
You should always avoid any kind of drastic amount of humidity or dryness. But we live in a climate here in Springfield that is very wet in the summer and very dry in the winter. This is a lot more of a problem with acoustic guitars and thin, solid woods that'll crack easily. As far as the regular guitars, solid body electric guitars, or most electric guitars, you just want to avoid drastic amounts of humidity and wetness. If you store them in a basement or anything like that, certainly get them off the floor. Not just because your basement might flood, but also because the humidity is probably going to be a bit more down there, collect down there. Temperatures is another issue to be concerned about, but the biggest thing is the shock of a changed temperature. I've left guitars out in my car in the winter and they got down to freezing temperature. If you bring it right into a warm room and open the case, that shock of 40-degree or more change in temperature is very damaging to a guitar finish and in some cases a guitar. If you bring it in the case and bring it in the garage, let it acclimate for an hour, bring it into the house another hour, and then open it up, generally the whole thing has slowly acclimated. But humidity is mainly a problem with acoustic guitars, except you don't want to get your guitar wet. And we sweat on them, so we should wipe that off. So, anybody else? Yes, Mr. Gamey.
Just a comment about your guitarming.
Yes.
I don't think it was because there was 3 guitar players, because Billy took 2 rides, Dave took 2 rides, Tom took 2 rides, then they took a ride where they all traded rides back and forth, and then they played one at the end that they all played at the same time.
You sound like you were there. Yes, Dave was there during some of the cacophony known as the Guitar Army. So, Guitar Army.
Every song, too.
And then we play the next set.
Well, no, we usually got at least 2 songs in a set. You know, they were rarely more than 20 minutes long. So, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Like I said, there's posters, DVDs, CDs. Take what you want, 1 apiece. If you feel like donating, please give to Music Monday. Thank you.